Good Sunday afternoon to everyone out there. This is Aaron Williams, your host for the Organic Theologian. Last time on Organic Theologians, we talked about meaningful conversation and the lack of it in the church today. And I think I tried to show how that meaningful conversations lead to meaningful relationships, which is one of the roots and core things that build community. Today I would like to talk more about some of the things that we do that are counterproductive to community. Some of the things we say, some of the things in our liturgy on Sundays that isn't quite productive for building community. One of the things that I've really noticed over the last few years that people do, and not for the last few years, I've actually questioned it probably for, probably about last 10 years of my life. There's a phrase that the leadership, the elders of the church usually say, if it's the one opening up the service, or it's the pastor when he comes to give the sermon. It's a phrase that they say that quite common, it's very traditional, it's been around for hundreds of years, but I would just like to stop and really think about it and really weigh out whether it's actually productive or counterproductive to actually creating a community of believers who are more attached to each other, more knowledgeable of each other on personal levels, and see if this phrase actually is in the culture and the way that we use it in the culture today, to see if this phrase is actually being productive in those community building ways. I know at first people are going to, maybe especially pastors and people who use this phrase a lot. I think even myself, and sometimes you don't like to judge yourself and think, well, I did that too, but I'm pretty sure I did. But it's a phrase we've all used and very traditional, so it may make some people get defensive at first, or maybe raise their hair for a minute. But it's the phrase, the house of God. Usually whoever starts out the meeting on Sunday mornings, you usually say, oh, ain't it good to be in the house of God? Or they'll say, thank you for coming out to the house of God. And the pastor stands up most of the time and they'll say, it's good to be in the house of God. Now, I know most of you people are going to know where I'm going with this. This isn't unheard of, but I do want to point out one thing that I don't hear a lot of about this. But you know probably where I'm going. I listened to a pastor probably about a month ago who actually made a disclaimer about that phrase. Somebody had opened up the service and they used that phrase, and when it come time for him to give his sermon, he wanted to give a disclaimer on the phrase, the house of God, and he said, you know that this is not the house of God. And he didn't quote the scripture, but the first scripture that comes to my mind is that which is in the Old Testament, the heavens is my throne and the earth is my footstool. And then you think about what he told David, when David wished to build a house for him, he said, how can you build a house for me? He said, I cannot be contained, So we think about all those phrases and we think about, the Spirit of God cannot be contained, or is not contained and stays in one place, as it did in the Old Testament. And that's something we need to struggle with. Most people don't never think about is that even in the Old Testament, we see that God was trying not to contain himself to just that tent that was in the middle of the children of Israel as they wandered in the wilderness. And he wasn't trying to contain himself to that house he let Solomon build for him. Because in that same Old Testament, you have those phrases where he says, you cannot contain me. And I know that what people will think, or maybe the Jewish people would reply back to, well, we knew that God was everywhere. We got that, but our connection to him was through the tent. Our connection to him was through the temple. But that argument is neither here nor there for the purposes of this podcast today. For us that are New Testament believers, I want us to really seriously think about, we know that the temple was just a point in time, a signpost. Now we are the temple of God. When we listen to Paul preaches, and that's a theme that Paul actually comes out with, that know ye not that you are the temples of God. There's no denying that was, Paul had took the old way of thinking about the temple and as a geographical location, and now has placed it upon the hearts. And even Jesus himself said that, you're not going to worship me. He told the woman, you're not going to worship me here on that mountain or this mountain here or there, but there's a day you're going to come and worship me in spirit and truth, and it won't really matter where it's at. So we know the New Testament is doing away of the geographical location of the Spirit of God being where you met with the Spirit of God, to now He is in us. And wherever we are, whatever we're doing, if we are the people of God, if we have accepted Him and His sacrifice of love for us, and accepted that way, He dwells now with us at all times. So I want to speak more to us who are in that mindset today. So I know that we know that God is not contained to that building, and that's what that pastor I was mentioning, he really wanted to make that clear. And I kind of ponder, sometimes as Protestants, as evangelical Christians, why would it even be necessary for this pastor to even say such a thing? Because we do know that. And really what that is, that's an indication of something that you do see going on inside the church, but not just inside the building, the church building itself. It's something you see going on in the church, the people that's called the church outside the building. And I think that's where the alarm is starting to come, and it's been there, in my opinion, for a long time. I think it's actually due to, once we started using this terminology hundreds of years ago, that it actually, because it's not really proper terminology, it's not really New Testament terminology. And even though we may have not have meant it to sound like Old Testament terminology, it's actually Old Testament terminology. And even though we knew as Protestants, as evangelicals, as Reformation people, we knew that phrase, yes, is Old Testament, but we meant it in more of a figurative way. But the problem that has arose, that has made this pastor felt the necessity to make this disclaimer about this, and I've heard other pastors through the years try to do this. What they're trying to combat is that there are people that are in the way of the Messiah people, Christians, who really put a lot of emphasis on the Sunday and Wednesday in their practical life and in their weekly practices. They really emphasize their practices on that day, and they really, really slack on the days that they're not at that building. And there is why these pastors seem to feel the necessity to actually bring these things up. And it is true, and I think that's, and I'm going to get to why that actually is counterproductive to actually building a community of people that have meaningful conversations together. And what it is that they're seeing, and why I'm making this podcast is that you can have your pastor, your most honored elder, the most spiritual among you, and they're using this phrase. And what's happening is that people are starting to see these people on Sunday. And the truth is that you rarely see them any other day of the week, which is strange inside of itself, that in a year's time, people don't spend hardly any time with their elders or with their pastor outside of the Sunday, Wednesday church setting. But what they do notice when they do spend that time is that in their house or in their outings together, they do notice that there's not as much emphasis given to calling upon the name of God or relying upon the presence of God to help them in a conversation they're having, or they don't even lead the conversations to make sure that God's included in some of those conversations. They kind of separate. On Sundays, we'll talk about Christian ethics, we'll talk about Christian morality, we'll talk theology on Sundays, but when you're with them in their homes or when you're with them out in their outings, they notice that the conversation is very void of any of those. And so people see that, and out of the leadership, and so then they ponder to themselves, why? They don't even have to ponder. It's really a default mode, because they're looking to them as leadership, and they're most of the time, and this is the truth, A lot of new Christians and even older Christians don't question what a leader is doing in the church or a theological matter, or they don't really question anything. They just go with it. They just come and they go with what's being said and done. And most of the time they never question anything unless it actually does get up against something that they're not for or they're against. But most of the time they just go with the flow of it. And so as they're out with these leaders and these pastors and they're out with them in their daily life and they notice that there's not too much of the same kind of practice that they see on Sunday, not too much theological discussion, not too much incorporating God into the discussion. And they even, and here's another key thing I want to mention, even with elders and pastors in the church, they'll watch, even when you watch how they conduct their family, how they lead their family, the conversations they're having with their children, the conversation they're having with their wife outside of church in their everyday life, they'll notice that they're not using the same language that they use with the people of God on Sundays. It's a pretty stark difference sometimes when they get to looking. And being that most people don't question, they're actually looking to leaders to lead them, and they're not really questioning, they don't really practice critical thinking. They just accept this as a mode. Well, the thing about that is that when you don't have a conversation that's outside of the church that is as theological as you have on the inside, that's as spiritual as what you have on the inside of the church, and your outside the church life has way less of that going on, you start developing a community of people. And here's the truth, that if you're not having that discussion on the outside, if you're not having that conversation on the outside on a majority of the time, then whatever bonds you're building with that layperson is really not the community of God, because the community of God are the soldiers of God. They're the fighters. We are fighting for the kingdom of God. And so if you're not discussing the things of the kingdom outside the church, which is a more majority of our time, we spend 2 hours on Sunday, maybe a couple hours on Wednesday. But if we are not spending that time outside the church, which is a bigger majority of time, and having those conversations with each other, then they're going to see that this community is more based upon carnal or secular conversation than it actually is about theological and spiritual. To give an example, as I said, I grew up in the Pentecostal church, and one of the things that I noticed in the Pentecostal church is that on Sunday there was a high expectation of the Spirit of God to move, and I say rightly so. We would expect for somebody to be, those that were sorrowful, those that were heavy laden, we would expect a blessing from God as we prayed for them, that they would be lifted up high. Those that were sick, we would pray for healing. We would expect healing for them, whatever they need. But then, later on in the week, if you went to their home, you've seen that sick person, or if you, and I'm not talking about major sickness. I'm just talking about somebody that may have be having a terrible back pain, But as you've seen them through the week, there's not that much where they didn't offer to pray with them anymore. I'm not talking about a pastoral visit to see them. I'm just talking about a casual visit to see them as a friend. That you would notice that the conversation would just be talking about work or talking about their hobby or this, that, and the other as they walked around with their back pain, that they had. Because I want to state that again, we're not talking about a pastoral visit. We're talking about people of the community just spending time with each other. Now, I'm going to get to something here in a minute that probably you all are thinking, but we'll get to in a second, that I never noticed the conversation actually about a deep theological subject. If somebody was in despair about trying to figure out some answers to financial, relationship, family matters, work, when they were trying to find out what's the right way to go, I never seen them get into a Bible study approach, getting together and biblically discussing what does the Bible say about these issues, about what I'm going through, about this there. You didn't see that when they just went and visited them on a regular basis. It was sometimes just seemed like it was that was only meant for Sunday and Wednesday. We'll only bring that up there. And the strange thing about that in the churches I grew up in, when you bring that up on just Sunday and Wednesday, there never was any biblical study about it. It was just always prayer. More of an emphasis on hearing from the Spirit of God, but less on hearing the Spirit of God through the Word. So I noticed these things, and then I would hear an elder talk about church discipline, or I would hear a pastor speak about that, and he would preach on it about this is how the church used to go through disciplinary. This is the kind of disciplinary. This is the church polity on these, and then you would go in their home and just be on a casual visit, and that's not what was existing in their home. It was quite a lower standard for the polity in the house than it was for the church. And if you're not a critical thinker, you're not going to sit and think, why is that? You're just going to kind of accept that. And that's what's been going on for many years inside of not just the Pentecostal church, but I've visited other denominations and got friends that are in other denominations, and this is the same story elsewhere. The church is where we're spiritual. The church is where we hold to certain standards there. But when we're not in the church, then we hold a certain standard there. And I'm not saying that some people have a good standard of modesty in dress. I'm not talking about in other denominations too. The Baptists, the Presbyterians, all of these people will have a standard of dress sometimes, even that they would carry out through the week there. But when it would come to maybe discussions on politics, maybe that they wouldn't hold that same standard for secular politics versus what the church politics was at. They wouldn't hold the same standard for their home, the discipline of the home, the character of the children, the character of the wife. They wouldn't hold them to that same standard that they would ask the children or the women or the men to hold inside of the church. Inside the church, we talk about let's not be foolish. And I guess there's an example. Let me just go off on that for a minute. This is the house of God. This is the phrase it's also used. This is a house of God. There's going to be the children are not to run in the sanctuary. They're not to eat in the sanctuary, not to drink, and some churches actually don't even want you drinking water in the sanctuary. And they would say this is a place to be respected. This is a holy place. And that terminology is actually, in a sense, is Old Testament terminology. That's actually turning the building into a temple, a literal temple. And now I know people are going to say, well, when we are discussing the things of God and when we come out to meet with God, when we praise and worship God, we don't need these distractions. We don't need to, but I get that. I understand that. So, but the thing that would get you is though when you go to visit a pastor and have dinner with him, the children in their house could be running rampant. The wife could not be hospitable, maybe just very, and I'm not talking, maybe very focused on her phone, focused on the children, focused on their phone, them not being hospitable, focused on this, and not being hospitable to the company that was there. And then even at that, the pastor's conversation could be very secular, very carnal. And let me use that word carnal, secular kind of, it's not a bad conversation, but it was just no conversation that alluded to anything of God. And so you would have, that would go on in the home. But we have these scriptures, though, that teach us that the men are the leaders of their home. It says even these same people will preach that the men are the priests of their home. So there's Old Testament terminology that's actually alluding to that the home is actually the temple. So I can understand using Old Testament terminology to kind of give a figurative of what the authority and the power and the presence and the focus of spiritual and theological matters should be inside the church building, but I don't understand its neglect inside of the home. And those should be one and the same. The ability to experience the presence of God in a leader's home should be just as expected as it is in a church building. And that's not what we have today. That's not what the children have had. And I always argue this when I speak about this issue is that growing up, you've seen a large emphasis, a large push of the power of God in the church building. But in the home, you've seen maybe just a small percentage of that same expectation in the house. And what happens there and what's going on is that this is what I was saying earlier, I'll get to talking about, is why was this able to happen? Why is this going on? Well, it's because we're not as communal as the New Testament church is supposed to be. And I guess this is why I'm bringing this up, and that's because this phrase, the way that we use it today, the house of God, and how we emphasize the presence and the power of God in this building, but we don't give the same emphasis to it whenever believers come together in a home. And I do, and I want to make a correction. I want to make a little caveat here, or a disclaimer. I want people to understand that I get it. Sometimes we just come to rest and relax with each other. I understand that. But I'm telling you, in the homes today, even in rest and relaxation, which you can do that in the church building too. But I know that for Sunday, we are coming to specifically worship. And we're specifically coming to listen to the sermon being preached. And I know that. That's what's in. But when we come together in a home, sometimes we think about we're just coming to relax. We're coming to have a dinner. I get that the atmosphere is more set towards just enjoying each other's company, and it's not actually focused more towards praise and worship towards God. But I do want to throw this out here for those who think, well, that's the way it's done. The early church did not do that, and this can be argued and we can talk about it later, but I'm just going to throw it out there. The early church, and I mentioned it in the last podcast, the early church was more focused on horizontal edification. And I'm using terminology that Dr. Tom Wadsworth uses. And I'll send you a link to, he has actually 7 lectures on the early church. And one of the things that's good about listening to somebody like Dr. Tom Wadsworth and studying first century church history is that you realize that you can't retrofit your culture and your church liturgy over onto their culture and church liturgy, because they did things way different than what we did. Their culture is way different than what we did. So you got to realize that when you're thinking about how are the proper ways to do church, what is it? And that's one of the things that Dr. Wadsworth really looked into and looked at. And even if you just study first century church history, if you look at the Ante-Nicene Fathers and read some of their works, you start to realize that, their conversation on Saturdays at their church meeting was the same as it was on Tuesday with visiting a brother, or their brother came to visit them. On any unscheduled visit, their conversation between each other as brothers and sisters was the same. Yes, there may be, yes, they might have asked for a cup of sugar. Yes, he may have needed you to come help get his ox out of the ditch. And there may be laughter about these things back and forth. But you would come to notice that the atmosphere was always based around their God. It was never far away. It was always come back full circle to their conversation, always come back full circle to their God. And that's actually how the culture was, even as pagan cultures. And, yes, it differed from one pagan belief or one pagan god to the other, but life revolved around your God. And so that wasn't hard for them. That was the normal. And that's not normal for us to, and that's what I'm saying. That's what we are seeing in the church today is that's why there's a separation between what we call, I say home life versus the church life. That's not really something that was there in the first century. That they understood that home life didn't need to. It was an impossibility to them to see that that those things could be different. They weren't afraid to talk about what they were doing at home in the church meeting, and they weren't afraid to talk about in the church things about the church at home. They did not separate them. They were focused. They were kingdom-minded. Their conversation was kingdom-minded. And we have been able to get away with that now. Our conversations are now, we have drawn a line between home and church life. And that should not be. He came. He inaugurated the kingdom on earth. And we're supposed to fight and make that kingdom hold standards and keep them on the earth as we are. And so to think that our conversation outside of a church meeting building and any meeting after that, it can be a more slack. If it's not Sunday, then my conversation can be more slack. I can hold my children and my wife to a more slack standard. To think that you can do that is not Christian-minded. It's not kingdom-minded. And some people will say, "Well, what do you expect? I've got to work. I've got to keep my yard mowed. I've got to keep the house up." I still don't understand why that would affect the conversation and the goal of your life. And that your goal of your life is thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, to tell the gospel, to shout it from the mountains. I don't understand why that would affect that, because you can be doing all that while you're doing that. And some people would say, well, I'm just going to be honest, I can't buy any excuse. And I would love to have some comments back. I mean, maybe there is an excuse. I don't see it. I don't know where it's at. So all I am saying is the conversation that your church has, that you have at church, the politics that your church has, the government that your church has, should not be separated from your home life. And in fact, if it is, it's actually hypocritical and somewhat deceitful on your part. And I think that's what a lot of Christians are really trying to do today by giving into this mode of the American Christian, that's church and this is home. And what it is that they know, and I'm going to get back to this. Some people say, Aaron, you're actually talking about an issue that doesn't exist, and they would be right. There is an issue that doesn't exist. One of the issues that doesn't exist is that we don't go to each other's homes and visit each other. We don't spend hardly if any time with each other through the week. And so everything that I've proposed and talked about is only if you've actually been the type of person who actually got out and visited your elders or your leaders of your church, or even just anybody, the lay people in the church. Even some lay people seem to hold a high pious righteousness when they're at the church meeting, the church building, what we call the church building, but when they're at another meeting, when they're at another get-together, that you can see a standard that drops. And a lot of times that's where you end up with a lot of problems and discussions inside. That's where some churches split. Sometimes you'll notice some of the biggest church splits, or some of the most reasons for church split, is actually what another member notices another member doing outside of the church and brings it to the scheduled church meeting and elders board to discuss it. But the truth is that we don't really spend any time with each other. We're not really doing life together. I heard a pastor say one time that we're doing life together, and I thought to myself, we are. And I pondered, I knew the people in the church, and I'm like, I don't know that any of these people visit anybody in this church more than once a month with each other. And even then, as I said, the conversation is on the shallow and meaningless level. And so even what time that they do spend, which is a rarity, it's not quality time. It's not actually the time that is meant for a Christian to spend together. So I ponder sometimes what this pastor I heard say that meant by we're doing life together. That would have been a proper phrase for the first century church, but I don't know about the 21st century church if that's actually a phrase. Not unless this pastor was actually meaning the 2 to 3 hours that they spend with each other on Sunday and the hour and a half that they spend with each other on Wednesday. And even there, as I said in my last podcast, you have meaningless conversation after the sermon's given. After the singing and after the sermon's given, you have meaningless conversation that leads to meaningless relationships. And so, yes, I am talking about a problem that doesn't exist, and that's what I've been hitting at the last few episodes, is trying to show that we really need to back up and reevaluate how we do church and how we call ourselves the community of Christ, the people of God. And then just that phrase, the people of God. Is this really what the people of God do? Is this really what God meant when he says, I'm making of me a holy people? Is this how this is done? And that's what I've been asking in the last few podcasts. But to get back to this phrase, some of this Old Testament terminology, which, as I said, I understand that, and I'm fine with using it in that figurative sense. The issue is it's becoming literal. It's turning from a figurative use into a literal use inside of our churches today. And the leadership of the church is actually promoting that. So, as I mentioned, this pastor that I listened to a few months ago actually said, give a disclaimer, this isn't the house of God. The house of God, God's presence is not contained here. God's presence is everywhere. God can touch your broken heart where you're at. The people of God can pray and sing praises to God. You can have a theological study, a Bible study. You can discuss the ways of God just as much outside this meeting as you can inside this meeting, and his greatness can be experienced just as much. And so I was uplifting, and I even said amen to that. But the fact of the matter is, and this is what the children, the millennials, the Gen Zers are seeing, is that these people can make that claim, but what they live with and what they've seen out of the baby boomer generation, out of Generation X, what they have actually seen out of the previous generations who are now the older leaders of the church is in de facto a claim of God's presence everywhere, but they more hold to this is the house of God, literal terminology inside the church, because they don't pray that hard at their homes. They don't sing worship songs or even require their children and family to get together and sing a worship to God in their homes. They don't have Bible studies in their homes. And I'm talking about real Bible studies. I'm not talking about sitting down and listening to somebody do a devotional and your kids are over there rolling their eyes. I'm talking about actually having real discussions with their children about what do you think about this, pushing and trying to encourage their children to actually wrestle with the things of God. And the discipline that they require in the house of God, where the children ain't to run, there's not to be screaming, there's not to be no water or food. I don't see them making those same kind of disciplinary actions even when they're not having a theological discussion in their house. Even if they're just getting ready to sit down and eat dinner, you can look around some leaders' homes and there's chip wrappers. Their children are running like wild animals all over the place. The children actually show a sense of rebellion to them, and you can notice it. You can see that this woman or this man is not actually the disciplinary that they need to be towards their children. You can see the lack of theological knowledge inside of their children as a direct derivative of their home teaching of their children. And I'm talking about elders and leaders in the church. But they at themselves can get up on Sunday morning and Wednesday night and go into great detail about the theological matters, exegeting Scripture to the minutest, talking about keeping church orderly. You hear them discuss all these things and say these things, but you can't see it in the home. And so these children grow up seeing that this was required over here, but we didn't do it over there. So it makes them not consciously, some consciously, but even subconsciously, you start to develop children who actually come to conclusions later on in their life that, hey, this is just for show. This is just a Sunday show that we go to because we don't practice or live this in the church. And the phrase that encapsulates that really, I think, covers it all for them is when their father, who is the elder of the church or who is a pastor of that church, gets up and says, "This is the house of God. I'm thankful to be in the house of God. I'm expecting to see God today in his house." But not that same expectation in the home. Even when believers are gathered together in their home, it's always never an expectation. And people say, well, that's fine to draw those lines between. And no, it's not. That's really a 21st century development that's developed out of hundreds of years of actually using this terminology, actually using this Old Testament terminology that started out figurative, but became more to be of a literal terminology. I mean, up until Constantine took the church, we didn't have, well, I say that, look, even before Constantine, we started to see inside of the church the altar, the call to the altar. That was not in the first century church. You won't find any records of anything where they talked about that in the first century, and going into the second century, you don't see that. And I've stated this before, when we start seeing that development is really when we start seeing a more Gentile church. And what do we have when we have a more Gentile church? We have people who come from a more pagan background to where this is how only way they knew to do this. And that's what Paul was really fighting against when he was bringing up and giving these theological schemes of the temple being the body of God. And that's really counterproductive. And it's really non-Pauline to actually, I do question what Paul would think about the way that we use this terminology and the practices that go along with it. And what I mean is if Paul's seen what some of these leaders are doing by saying this so strongly and seeing how they only expect to see God or see a move of God on their Sundays, but they never expect to see that in any gathering between the brothers through the week, I don't think I'm outside of what Paul would be talking about, right? That Paul would be disagree with. So this phrase, the house of God, being used by the leaders in today's church with the degree of intensity of the expectation of the move of the Spirit inside of their scheduled meetings, not being matched in their everyday life, is not just hypocritical, I think it's deceitful. Now, are they doing this consciously? Some, maybe. I think there could be a case made for it. It's on a case-by-case basis. But for the most part, I believe most of them are just doing it because it's an accepted way of being. The church has traditionally allowed this kind of action. And it's a development that's developed out of hundreds of years, really. If you really get to looking at it, it's just developed into what it is because of hundreds of years of using this phrase, and then a lack of where they've let it go from being figurative to actually being literal. And it became easy to do because it's hard to keep both ends of your life together. And the way we do church, where we're not a community, we're not communal like we're supposed to be, it's because you think about it, well, it's hard for me to be the priest in my house because I have really unruly children. It's hard for me to be the priest for my wife that I need to be because my work consumes so much time out of me. These things are have derived and have come into as an industrial revolution has come. These are things that really have burdened men down. And it's a problem. It's a complex problem as far as the home life and the priest life of the home has went. And because the community has fragmented and spends less time with each other as the years have gone on from the inception of the church until now, the church has shown a more fragmentation. It's more individualistic now. And it's because of that move towards a more individualistic minded church that these men understand some of these expectations at home, but they're alone. It's a hard thing alone. They're alone. They don't have the support, the discipleship that they need to carry out that role that they need to be accomplishing with their home. And so I can't just be, pull your bootstraps up and get it on, man. You need to get your house in better shape. It really is a church failure, and it's failure to be the true community, the true people of God, that has led to this fragmentation in the church, where you have elders and pastors and older people in the church who have struggled to be the priest of their home and hold to the same standard that they hold at the church meeting, because they've had to go at this alone, and it's been hard on them. And so I understand that. But at the same time, these men are men. They've had experiences with God, and they know that this cannot be right to hold this standard at a scheduled meeting, but not to hold the same standard at the home. And before the eyes of God, instead of just going with the tradition that's allowed this fragmentation, that has allowed the standard to be lower for the home life versus the church meeting, instead of going with the tradition that has allowed this, actually re-examine your life under what this is all about. It's under God. It's all about God. It is thy will be done on earth as in heaven. Not the tradition's will be done. Yes, the tradition may be trying to do the will of God, but as men, you are to make sure, as the priest of your home, that your tradition is actually being in right standard with God. And so, at the end of the day, it is your responsibility to do this. And because the men have done this in the past few generations, have allowed for this fragmentation of the family that is supposed to be actually the church, because the church is made up of people, it's made up of families. So they've allowed this fragmentation outside of church meetings. And because they've allowed this, we're starting to reap now the consequences from this next generation, from the millennials, from the Gen Zers. We're starting to reap the example of that. They're looking at it and they're saying, this is bogus. This is double standard. This is not... It's not being transparent. And even when they call this out, even when millennials call it out, even when the Gen Zers call this out on the leadership, then they put up the leadership wall of steel. You can't touch this. And the millennials, the Gen Zers are saying, okay, we can't touch it, but we don't have to go along with it. And so if you look in your church, and you don't see a lot of millennials, you don't see a lot of Gen Zers, I'm telling you, this is what's going on. And you need to think about, hey, maybe some of the terminology and how we've fragmented the home life, which is the church life, but we've separated them. We've not made them one and the same. Maybe this has caused the decline of the numbers of young people in the church. So, in closing, it may seem all right to say this is the house of God in a figurative way, and it may be all right to get up and give a disclaimer to make sure that people understand you're saying it in a figurative way. It's not all right to say those things and actually not live those things in your everyday life. Thank you for listening. Put your comments in the box below. And until next time, be careful out there.